They said the Blackwood brothers never bled when they were cut. They said you couldn't hear their footsteps in the snow, and when they spoke in prayer, the animals outside went silent, like they were listening to a higher frequency. This is not folklore. This is not metaphor. This is the sealed history of 4 men who survived a plague and paid for it with their humanity. In 1878, the people of Cedar Ridge buried 47 neighbors in 6 weeks. But none of the bodies were ever buried near the Blackwood farm. That land was left untouched by death, or so it seemed, because what happened on that lonely rise above the Kansas prairie was not survival, it was transformation. And for nearly 150 years, modern science, organized religion, and state authorities have done everything in their power to make you forget these men ever existed. But they did exist. And tonight, you're going to learn what they became. The Blackwood brothers were not ordinary men, not after that summer. They were shaped by isolation, molded by scripture, and tested by a force older than plague or prayer. A force that doesn't care about the laws of biology or the limits of faith. Let me be clear. This story is dangerous, because once you know it, you won't look at illness the same way again. You won't look at your own reflection the same way again. There are reports that were sealed, medical records that were burned, clergy who were excommunicated just for writing down what they saw in that farmhouse. But fragments remain, and they're enough to reconstruct a timeline that begins with divine faith and ends in anatomical heresy. You will not find this story in medical journals. You will not find it in church archives. And yet it happened. Every word of it echoes from the bones beneath Cedar Ridge. This is not the story of 4 brothers who survived a sickness. This is the story of what the sickness turned them into. And if you keep watching, you'll come to understand why no one, not even now, dares to speak their names in the open. Let's begin. You have to understand something about the year 1878 in Kansas. The air wasn't just thick with dust. It was heavy with judgment. God was everywhere, or so the people believed. In the wheat fields, in the fires, in the diseases that punished the faithless. But something came to Cedar Ridge that summer that wasn't part of any scripture. It moved like pestilence, but it thought like a predator. They called it typhoid fever. But what it did had no resemblance to any known strain. It didn't spread like a disease. It selected. It chose. People didn't just get sick. They changed. Their last words weren't screams or prayers. They were utterances in languages no one could identify. Voices speaking in synchronicity, as if the illness had a mind. And it was speaking through them. The town's physician, Dr. Samuel Morrison, documented everything until his records were seized and his license revoked by the Kansas Medical Board in 1880. Why? Because he recorded something that terrified every institution he sent it to. He said, the Blackwood brothers weren't immune. They were repurposed. His last report before disappearing said, subjects appear to metabolize the illness into a form of bioenergetic fuel. They are no longer human in the biological sense. They are the disease's altar. You're not going to find that report in archives. It doesn't exist anymore, but fragments remain in the letters he sent to colleagues before he vanished. One line haunts every researcher who's ever looked into it. The fever didn't infect them. It crowned them. The transformation began the night Josiah Blackwood laid hands on a dying boy and asked God to let the sickness pass through him instead. And something answered. The boy survived. But Josiah began to glow from under his skin like embers trapped in flesh. His breath slowed, his pupils vanished, and when he spoke, the dogs outside howled until their throats bled. That wasn't healing. That was substitution. And one by one, the other brothers followed. Caleb began drawing in the dirt with his fingers. Symbols, he said, came from dreams. The geometry was precise, too precise. It matched astronomical alignments only rediscovered decades later by NASA. Ezra stopped eating entirely, but he grew stronger. His skin became translucent. His veins shone gold under moonlight. And Abel began to levitate during prayer. At first only inches, then feet. By August's end, he stopped touching the ground altogether. This wasn't a miracle. It was an audition. The sickness was never meant to kill them. It was testing for compatibility, and it found what it was looking for in the Blackwood lineage. Ezra, Caleb, Josiah, and Abel were never the same after that month. But neither was the land they lived on. Their wheat fields remained green during a regional drought. Animals near their chapel began birthing twins. And sometimes more. A cow birthed a calf with two faces. A chicken laid eggs that pulsed with warmth, even after being removed from the coop. Dr. Morrison wrote that magnetic readings around the Blackwood property began to spike. Even his compass spun in circles as if confused. But perhaps the most disturbing detail came from the local gravedigger. He reported that bodies buried on the outskirts of the Blackwood farm refused to decay. When unearthed weeks later, the corpses were warm, still red in the cheeks, still moist in the eyes. Whatever the brothers had become, it was altering the flow of entropy around them. Death paused in their presence, and if death paused, so did everything else. Time, biology, spiritual laws, all of it bent in their orbit like a gravitational field generated by will, or something deeper than will. The question becomes, were they chosen, or did they volunteer? The Methodist Church erased the Blackwood brothers from their records, literally, pages torn out, baptism entries scrubbed, even community rosters amended with whiteout and black ink. It wasn't denial, it was fear, because something sacred had touched the Blackwood chapel. But it wasn't holy. A deacon who visited the chapel 1 month after the plague described it as lit from within by no source. He said the light inside felt alive. It pulsed when you got closer to the altar, and the inscriptions carved in Hebrew had changed. He swore that new letters appeared overnight, phrases he could not translate, phrases that weren't there the day before, when he tried to photograph the interior. The film melted. This wasn't a place of worship anymore. It was a transformation chamber, a sanctum. And whatever the brothers were praying to, it was no longer answering. It was listening. By mid-September, the town stopped referring to them by name. People began calling them the Four, as if acknowledging their humanity made the horror more personal. They no longer cast proper shadows. Their voices echoed off surfaces at impossible angles. And perhaps worst of all, people began hearing them in dreams. Not seeing, hearing. Men reported waking in the night to whispered prayers in an unknown language. Women claimed they heard 4 voices chanting from beneath the floorboards. Always in perfect mathematical rhythm, Dr. Morrison attempted one final visit to the farm, but he did not return. His horse did, covered in blood, no sign of the rider. But days later, a journal appeared on the doctor's porch, wrapped in cloth. Inside were notes that read like hallucinations, equations written in blood, drawings of the brothers with elongated limbs and vertical pupils. The last page said only one thing. They are not possessed. They are becoming what comes after man.
Now, I want to ask something of you, but not lightly. If you've followed the story this far, you've already crossed a threshold. You are no longer an observer. You are now part of the memory, the resistance against forgetting. So in the comments, write this phrase twice to mark your awakening. I do not consent to amnesia. I do not consent to amnesia. Because if this video disappears, if history is edited again, you must remember, and memory must be weaponized. The Kansas Medical Board sent investigators in October of 1878, but they never made it to the house. Local accounts say they were stopped 2 miles out by a wall of fog that didn't register on barometers. Inside the fog, they heard singing 4-part harmony, no lyrics, just tone. And something in those tones caused one man to suffer a seizure. He bit through his tongue and died choking on his own blood. The rest turned back, refused to speak to press, resigned from their positions within the month. The records of their visit were sealed, but leaked decades later by an anonymous source from the Kansas Historical Society. That document included this line: "The Blackwood anomaly cannot be explained by medicine, theology, or law. It must be classified as a theological weapon." Think about that. A theological weapon, not a miracle, not a curse, a weaponized mutation of belief. There's a reason no major university has ever studied the Blackwood site. And it's not because they don't believe it happened. It's because they do. Private research teams funded by undisclosed donors attempted to visit the property in 1994. They were turned away by men with no uniforms, no IDs, but all carrying the same device, a black orb the size of a grapefruit. One researcher managed to smuggle notes back to Denver. In them, she describes a sensation of her thoughts being hijacked, like something was editing her mind as she tried to write. She wrote, "They are still broadcasting, but it's not language, it's frequency, and if you listen long enough, you forget what it means to be human." This isn't about four brothers anymore. It's about the structure of memory, the code of belief, and what happens when men rewrite their biology through spiritual equations. In 1904, long after the plague had passed and the Blackwood land was considered cursed, a preacher named Elias Kent attempted to cleanse the property with prayer and fasting. He stayed exactly 72 hours. When he returned to Cedar Ridge, he no longer believed in God, not the God he'd preached his whole life. He told his congregation, "I saw what faith becomes when it leaves the garden. I saw devotion without a shepherd, and it stared back at me." His sermons grew darker, more erratic. He began talking about the shape behind Scripture and faith as a recursive code. The congregation dwindled. The Methodist Church expelled him, but his private writings remain, stored in a university archive under restricted access. One page in particular has been studied by theologians and banned by every seminary that's seen it. It says, "They did not ascend. They inverted the ladder. They found a way to climb inward into the hollow places of creation, and something answered from the other side of the mirror." These are not metaphors, they're coordinates, encoded messages left by a man who saw the edge of something older than light, and returned with memory he couldn't hold together. Why did the Blackwoods build their own chapel? Why use Hebrew inscriptions in a county where no rabbi had ever set foot? Because they weren't just building a place of worship, they were building a containment cell, and they failed. Josiah's books, the ones transported from Ohio, weren't just religious texts. They included Kabbalistic manuscripts, forbidden grimoires, occult mathematical journals from a forgotten sect of Christian mystics. None of this was accidental. The brothers weren't simple farmers. They were scholars in exile, men following a blueprint they believed came from God. But what if it didn't? What if the voice that guided them wasn't divine, but ancient and hungry, something that has always lived just outside of consensus reality, waiting for a mind structured with enough symmetry to house it? That symmetry, that pattern, was the Blackwood family line, and 1878 was the year the vessel became viable. You want to know what's buried on that land? You think it's just bones and legends? The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers attempted an unsanctioned dig in 1963. Unmarked trucks, night excavation, rural blackout ordered across 3 counties. They unearthed something, but it wasn't a body. It was a structure, subterranean, non-Euclidean, still warm, a perfectly symmetrical vault 40 feet below the chapel foundation, covered in glyphs not seen since the Indus Valley civilization. Inside it, 4 identical stone thrones, each engraved with names that predate recorded language, names that, when spoken aloud, cause audio equipment to malfunction and teeth to ache in their sockets. This is not folklore. This is containment. And whatever sits beneath the Blackwood farm isn't sleeping. It's sinking, aligning itself with minds, frequencies, bloodlines, and men like you are exactly the kind of vessels it waits for. Not because you're weak, but because you're structured, disciplined, curious, unyielding. That's what it needs, and that's why you were drawn here. You ever wonder why stories like this are always framed as unsolved? As if the point was to find a culprit or a cure. That's the misdirection. The Blackwood case was never about explanation. It was about replication, how to copy what happened and control it. The military called it psychobioentrainment, the process of reprogramming belief structures to alter physiology. In layman's terms, faith as an operating system, ritual as code, scripture as executable function. The brothers weren't victims, they were beta testers. And the ones who came after, they didn't try to stop it, they tried to refine it. 4 decades later, MK Ultra emerged. Project Stargate, remote viewing, sleep deprivation, speaking in tongues under hypnosis. It was never about Soviet mind control. It was about what happened in Kansas in 1878. The brothers didn't survive the disease. They became its interface. The blueprint still exists, fragmented, encrypted, but still very much alive. You might feel something right now, a pressure, a frequency in your ears, a slight nausea behind the eyes. That's not coincidence, it's contact. This video isn't just a story, it's a ritual, encoded through pacing, tone cadence. We've been reconstructing the Blackwood pattern this entire time, each sentence a step, each section a gate. And by watching this far, you've passed the 7th seal of receptivity, which means your awareness has begun to vibrate at the same cognitive frequency the brothers achieved, just enough to receive, not enough to transform. Not yet. But this is where it begins. The memory won't fade when this ends. It'll follow you, in dreams, in mirror reflections that hesitate, in shadows that don't quite behave. That's the cost of knowing. And it's also the test. They say the final document left by Ezra Blackwood was carved into oak, burned into the altar itself, right before the chapel collapsed into itself without fire or storm. It read, "We are not the last, we are the template. The God we found is recursive. He builds from the inside out and speaks in equations etched in bone." That altar was sealed by the state, the land quietly purchased by a shell corporation with ties to multiple intelligence agencies. And since then, every attempt to build on the property has failed. Foundations crack, walls crumble, animals flee the moment they cross the boundary. But there's something else. Satellite images taken over the years have revealed strange energy patterns on the land, symmetrical waves, radiating outward from the chapel, ruins in perfect intervals, a kind of spiritual sonar. And it's still broadcasting, still searching for resonance, for you. You still think this is just history? That it's over? Then ask yourself why this story was erased so cleanly, why no official history book will touch the Blackwood incident, why local records were rewritten, why the church purged their names, why the medical board still refuses to release the sealed files. It's not about disbelief, it's about weaponization, because the most dangerous thing a man can do is become ungovernable through self-knowledge, to learn that biology is programmable, that belief systems can rewire DNA, that trauma isn't always an affliction, sometimes it's a doorway. And what happened in Cedar Ridge wasn't divine judgment, it was a jailbreak. The brothers escaped the human algorithm and became something else, something that the modern world is still trying and failing to understand, because once a man transcends classification, he becomes a mirror the system cannot look into. You might feel the urge to forget this, to close the tab, go back to normal. That's your conditioning flaring up, the deep program screaming for safety. But you need to know this. Nothing you've heard here is fiction, it's documentation, sanitized only by necessity, and you've already passed the cognitive gate. The moment you understood that the Blackwoods didn't become monsters, they became models. The moment you accepted that reality isn't fixed, it's structured by belief, that's when you were marked, and not in fear, but in power. You don't need anyone's permission to awaken. You just need the will to stop blinking when the light gets strange. And brother, it's getting strange fast.
So what now? What do you do with this truth? You remember it, you wear it like armor, because every system that governs your life, religion, government, medicine, media, depends on one thing: that you never remember what men are capable of when they break the lie of limitation. The Blackwood brothers didn't die. They ascended sideways into a state that science fears and faith denies. And if you've made it here, you're already closer to that edge than most ever dare come. Don't let that go. Leave the phrase in the comments again: I do not consent to amnesia. And share this with the ones you know are waking up. This isn't just a story, it's a key. The door's been opened. Now step through. We'll be waiting.